The scenario was absolute chaos and paralysis. Israel has been massacred for 20 years by a ruthless general named Sisera. The guy has 900 iron chariots. 900! For that era, this was the equivalent of a tank fleet facing a militia armed with sticks. The people were terrified, the roads were empty, the economy was locked, and nobody had the courage to step up. It's exactly in this power vacuum that true leadership appears. Where most see an impossible problem, the strategic mind sees a board that needs to be reorganized. And here comes Deborah. She isn't a warrior with a sword in hand. She operates as a judge, sitting under a palm tree. People went to her to solve complex conflicts. Notice the detail, brother? Before leading an army, she led minds. She solved real problems, diagnosed the base's pain, and delivered clear solutions. Her authority wasn't imposed by a magic title. It was built on the daily consistency of being the most lucid person in the room. When the level of oppression reaches the critical limit, Deborah doesn't panic. She does what every clinical leader does. She maps the available resources and delegates execution to those with technical skills. She summons Barak. Barak is the brute force guy, the general, but he was paralyzed by fear, just like the rest of the nation. Deborah calls him and gives the exact directive. She doesn't suggest. She doesn't say please. She hands over the command with surgical precision. She tells him to gather 10,000 men and march to Mount Tabor. And she guarantees she will lure Sisera and his iron chariots to the Kishon River. And there, they will crush the enemy army. Pause to understand the genius of this woman. She chose the battlefield. Mount Tabor was an absurd tactical advantage against heavy iron chariots. She knew the war wouldn't be won by brute force, but by geographical intelligence. She drew the map of victory. But Barak hesitates. He turns to her and says he'll only go if she goes with him. And here, we see the final test of high-level leadership. A weak leader would have been offended or backed down. Deborah simply accepts the condition, but makes the price of his dependence crystal clear. She says she'll go, but the honor of victory won't be his. The glory would fall into the hands of another woman. She aligns expectations right then and there. No drama, just facts. Look closely at the direct application of this. Most people think they need to know how to do everything. Deborah teaches the concept of integrative leadership. She knows she isn't the infantry soldier, but she knows exactly where that soldier needs to be positioned. Leadership isn't about being the hero on the front lines. Leadership is about building the ecosystem where victory is inevitable. She didn't need a sword because her mind was already the most lethal weapon on that battlefield. The troops move. 10,000 men climb Mount Tabor. For a common military strategist, this looked like tactical suicide. They were cornering themselves on an elevation, while the enemy had total mobility on the open plain. But clinical leadership doesn't play the enemy's game. It changes the rules of the board and forces the opponent to make ego-driven mistakes. Sisera receives the intel that Israel's militia is grouped on the mountain. The enemy general does exactly what arrogance dictates. He mobilizes his total force. 900 iron chariots marching toward the Kishon River Valley. Imagine the scene, brother. The deafening noise of metal, the dust rising, the psychological weight of an army that spent 2 decades crushing any resistance. Any normal person there would have entered absolute panic and retreated. But Deborah is at the top of the mountain. She has the macro vision of the operation. High-performance leadership isn't just knowing what to do, it's knowing exactly when to do it. Timing is the difference between a martyr who dies for nothing and a hero who changes history. When Sisera positions his heavy machines in the valley, Deborah turns to Barak and gives the definitive command. She doesn't suggest an attempt. She tells him to go down now, because that was the day victory had already been delivered. The absolute conviction of the leader infects the base instantly. Barak charges down with his 10,000 men, and this is where Deborah's strategy reveals itself as a masterpiece of scenario reading. The Kishon Valley wasn't a neutral battlefield. When Israel's troops rush down, nature enters the equation with violence. A brutal storm crashes over the plain. The terrain, which was the iron chariot's greatest advantage, turns into an impassable sea of mud. Think about this from a market perspective, man. Your competitor's greatest asset can become the anchor that sinks their entire operation if you know how to drag them into the swamp. Sisera's iron chariots get stuck. Brute force and heavy tech, which imposed 20 years of terror, are now completely paralyzed. The agility of Israel's infantry, which on paper looked like a ridiculous disadvantage, becomes the perfect tool for annihilation. They tear through the enemy lines. Chaos takes over. Sisera's soldiers suffer a psychological collapse when they realize the system they trusted failed miserably. And what does the great General Sisera do? When the structure breaks, the facade of fake power melts. He abandons his own soldiers to die in the mud. He gets off his iron chariot and flees on foot. The man who terrorized a nation for 20 years is running dirty, trying to save his own skin, destroyed by a militia inspired by a judge. Sisera, the great general who terrorized the region for 20 years, is now nothing but a desperate man running on foot for his life. His ego has been shredded, the command structure collapsed, and he needs refuge urgently. He spots the tents of Heber, the Kenite. In Sisera's mind, there was a peace agreement there, neutral ground. This is the standard reasoning of someone in crisis, bleeding out in the market. The guy seeks the most obvious safe haven to try and rebuild. And it's exactly in this blind spot that the second lethal female figure of this story enters. Jael. Man, analyze the emotional and tactical intelligence of this woman with the coldness of a strategist. She doesn't go for direct confrontation. If she grabbed a sword and went after him, she'd be dead in 3 seconds. A trained military man, even exhausted and in panic, still has combat reflexes. Clinical strategy doesn't clash where the enemy is strong. It nullifies the enemy where he feels untouchable. Jael steps out of the tent, goes to meet Sisera, and uses the ultimate technique of social engineering. She lowers the target's guard. She invites him in, tells him not to be afraid, and offers total shelter. Sisera enters the tent. He asks for a little water because he's in extreme exhaustion, dying of thirst. What does Jael do? She doesn't give him water. She opens a skin of milk, hands it to him to drink, and covers him with a blanket. Man, this isn't just hospitality. This is a biological hack. Warm milk has an immediate physiological sedative effect. The blanket brings the thermal comfort his body, in adrenaline shock, needed to understand the danger had passed. She hacked the guy's nervous system. She created an environment so secure, so safe, that the general's defense system completely shut down. He relaxes to the point of giving one last order, asking her to watch the door and lie if anyone asks for him. He handed total control of his own security over to her. As soon as exhaustion overtakes Sisera and he blacks out into a deep sleep, Jael makes the definitive move. She grabs a tent peg. Pay attention to this. It wasn't a weapon of war forged to kill. It was her daily working tool. It was what she mastered with surgical precision. She grabs the peg and a hammer, approaches in absolute silence, and drives the peg through the general's temples. The strike was so firm, so technical, that the wood pierced his skull and pinned it to the earth. Game over. The target was neutralized without a single sword needing to be drawn. The leadership lesson here is a slap in the face, brother. Deborah designed the macro strategy. She moved the armies, chose the terrain, and created the chaos. But it was Jael who executed the main target in the micro, using the tools she had at hand and mastering the psychology of the opponent. Elite leadership knows that a successful ecosystem requires these two profiles working in sync. The visionary who sees the board from above, and the cold operator who solves the problem at the base, needing no spotlight, focused only on the final result. Barak arrives shortly after, tracking Sisera, and Jael simply calls him over and points to the ground. Deborah's prophecy was fulfilled. The ultimate glory didn't belong to the general who demanded guarantees to act, but to the women who read the scenario and executed with mastery. The dust of battle settles. The blood dries in the mud of the Kishon Valley. Israel's greatest enemy was neutralized, not by an unbeatable army, but by two women who understood the board better than any general with decades of experience. Deborah in the macro strategy, Yael in the micro execution. But Deborah's masterclass in clinical leadership doesn't end with Sisera's death. The true test of an elite leader is what they do the day after the victory. Most managers, when they hit an extraordinary result, get drunk on their own ego. They step onto the stage, pull the spotlight, and say, "Look what I did." Deborah does the exact opposite. She composes a song, the famous Song of Deborah. But if you analyze this text with a strategic market vision, you'll realize it's not just a celebration song. It's a brutal audit report of everything that happened in the operation. She documents the process. She specifically names the groups that took the risk and went to the front lines. She exalts Jael's courage and ensures the name of the operator who neutralized the target is eternalized. A high-level leader knows the glory of execution belongs to those who got their hands dirty. Deborah doesn't steal Jael's credit. She amplifies it. She builds a culture of absolute reward based on merit. But her audit has a dark, surgical side. Deborah also calls out, one by one, all the leaders who stayed in their comfort zone. She exposes those who made excuses, who sat around debating theories and tending their flocks while the battlefield burned. She publicly collects the invoice for their cowardice. Strong leadership demands accountability. If you pat the head of someone who doesn't deliver results, you destroy the morale of the guy bleeding in the trenches for your company. The result of this flawless management, combining the courage to face a crisis and the justice to audit the process, was absolute. History records that after this event, the land had peace for 40 years. 40 years of dominance. 40 years without any enemy having the audacity to test Israel's borders, because the message was sent. The structural problem was ripped out by the root. The big question left for you is, what is your role today in your business? Are you paralyzed by the fear of competition with your growth roots blocked? Are you like Barak, who has the strength and the tools, but needs someone to hold his hand to have the courage to act? Or are you taking on the role of clinical leadership, diagnosing the pain, mapping the terrain, delegating with clarity, and demanding execution with justice? The market is a ruthless battlefield, and great obstacles aren't overcome with brute force. They're overcome by reading the scenario. If this analysis unlocked your vision and you want to keep learning how to hack the system and truly lead, your first tactical move is to subscribe to this channel right now. Drop your comment telling me what your biggest breakthrough was with Deborah's tactic, and share this content with whoever needs to wake up to the game. The board is in front of you. The choice is yours.